Hi everybody, welcome to another makeover. As soon as I saw this dresser, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with that. The most pieces I work with are usually solid wood and veneer combination or laminate in solid wood combination. But for the design I wanted to try, I wanted the piece to be all made out of particle board. And here it is. The frame and the legs of the dresser are solid, but the rest of the piece, it's a particle board. I wouldn't even call it laminated, it's a paper film covered. I started with removing hardware and then I moved on to measuring. If you're wondering what is that I'm measuring, this is the leftovers of blinds. I salvaged them from our local thrift store and I used them in one of my previous projects and I had leftovers. My original plan was to cover all 6 drawers with those blinds, but as soon as I started measuring, I realized that I didn't have enough. So I changed my plan and I decided to paint 2 drawers with the same color I was going to paint the body of the dresser. The blends were cut and ready to be glued, but before gluing, I cleaned the dresser with some TSP degreaser. While I was washing the drawers, I found out that the edge painting here and there came off. To speed up the process, I used the CA glue with an activator. And then I scuffed the surface with 220 grit. It wasn't necessary, but I did it just in case. To glue my wooden pieces to the top, I used this construction glue I found in my local hardware store. I glued my pieces to all 4 drawers and I clamped them and I let them dry for about 14 hours. The other 2 drawers needed some prep work as well. I wasn't gonna use an old hardware, so I needed to fill up the holes. But those holes they were smaller than the plugs I had, so I drilled them and made them a little bit bigger. I was gonna paint the drawers, and I know that even with the plugs in, there would be still tiny gap around those plugs. So instead of using some wood filler to fill up those gaps, I decided to try a CA glue. I applied some glue around those plugs and then I sprayed the activator. Next morning my glue was completely dried and I could work with the drawers, with the wooden drawers. On some of the drawers, I didn't have the corner pieces glued to the drawer because the pieces I pre-cut they turned out smaller than I expected. I decided to let the whole drawer dry and then to glue the final piece. So I measured and cut the pieces, and this time I used an epoxy glue because I didn't want to wait another 14 hours for my glue to dry. The epoxy glue I used dries in 5 minutes, but I let it sit for about half an hour. Once my epoxy glue dried, I was ready to sand the drawers. First, I took 100 grit sandpaper to level the edges. And then I sanded the blinds, started with 120 grit sandpaper, moved to 150 and finished with 220. I also scuff sanded the drawers with the plugs and I was pretty happy how the CA glue turned out. A smooth surface with no sign of old holes. I was gonna keep the legs bare wood, so I took them off and I put them aside for now. My plan was to paint the body of the dresser, so I scuffed it with 150 grit sandpaper to give my paint something to adhere to. While I was sanding, I discovered this big dent. To fill up those big dents, I usually use Bonda. Bonda is a two parts epoxy filler. It could be wood filler or an automotive filler. I use an automotive version and it works just fine for me. While my Bonda was drying, I used a drill to sand the legs. Once Bonda dried, I sanded it smooth and then I sealed the whole surface with some shellac. The reason why I use shellac is because I sanded through this laminate in some spots. The particle board has this grainy surface, and as soon as I apply some water-based paint, it could absorb paint differently, and I could see those spots. So to prevent this, I use shellac. I had lots of leftovers of different types and colors of the paint and paint mixed with the top coat, so I didn't want to buy any new paint. That's why I started mixing here. I don't want to bore you with the whole process of mixing my paint. Just want to say that I made the multiple layers of different colors of the paint, different shades, and I didn't like it, and I kept mixing and mixing until I got the color I was happy with. I think in total I applied about 7 coats of paint, and 3 last coats for the paint, the color of the paint I actually liked. And I didn't prime the piece because I actually mixed all in one paint. I added some primer and I added some top coat into my paint. To seal the drawers, my wooden drawers, and to get rid of the yellow undertone, I used my white hard wax oil. I bought it by accident from local Home Depot and it turned out quite handy. And I also sealed the legs with the same white hard wax oil. One of the drawers had a broken guide, so I had to replace it with a new one. But there was one little problem. The bottom panel of the drawers was a little bit bigger than the drawer. Thanks God it was a press board and it was easy enough to cut the place for my guide with a knife. I ordered a new hardware on Amazon and then I found out that I couldn't just put it on because the drawers fronts were thicker than usual. So I used my router to make a groove for the hardware to fit in. And we're almost at the finish line here, guys. I just had to attach the hardware and screw the legs back into their places. Let me remind you what this piece looked like before, and here's the after.